Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy Friday. It is our last show of the week, and we want to go out with a bang. We have a lot of good segments planned, some that are familiar to you and me, some that are new and going to be introduced to the show. So to start off, those will be our newer segments. I'm going to be doing something a little bit unusual where I take some of my favorite players from my rankings and put them into a list at each position of the favorite starts I have for the week, and also the same for the players who I believe should sit this week out. And then, of course, as always, by popular demand, the NFL games and college football games with the biggest implications will also occur on this show. Will actually not occur in real time on this show. They will occur over the weekend, but I will talk to them and explain them to you all in this show. And to close out the show, we return to the topic of Sunday Night Football. Going to give you a little bit of start-sit advice for that one as well. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you to consider liking, following, or subscribing to the show if you want to see more content such as this. We have a lot of different podcasts going on. We have a lot of different guys doing their own things. For example, the basketball podcast, now that the season is under full swing. We also have college football that's going to get wacky. We have so many good podcasts surrounded by so many different topics. So there's definitely many different ways you can contribute. But if you want to interact with our shows more directly while we are streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to contribute and interact directly with the show. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns throughout, it will pop up on my screen. If you leave a comment, I will read it out loud and you can get your opinion on the air. You can also click the $sign in the comment section on YouTube to leave a tip or donation as well. And everything you do is greatly appreciated. But without further ado, let us jump into our first segment of the day here. And like I said, it's a new one to the show. My favorite starts of the week. As you or some of you may know, throughout the week, I rank my favorite players from a matchups, from a performance perspective, in terms of at each position who I believe should start for you each weekend. But now I've compiled a list at each position of my favorite of those starts. Without further ado, hopefully you guys really like this one because it's going to be something that I think I'm going to continue from now until the end of the season. So let's jump right into it. Starting off, like I said, going to be breaking this down position by position with the QBs. And for some reason, this guy, in my mind, is going to have a big week. I don't know in what particular way. I don't know why I feel so strongly about this as a kind of fantasy option here for you. But I do believe that Kyler Murray is going to be someone who should start or consider starting this weekend. In this matchup against a Dolphins defense that certainly feels like it should be better because it has the star players at every level of the defense, but just hasn't been the elite defense we thought it was going to be this season. Obviously, Jalen Phillips looks like he might miss the entire season yet again, so that kind of issue of continuity is rearing its ugly head for this defense. And so I feel like there were a lot of positives to take away from Kyler Murray in that game with the Chargers that could translate into what is now a Dolphins defense that's looking a little bit more depleted than we think. Also, one thing that I did notice in that Chargers game was that Marvin Harrison and all these different receivers were running good routes. It was just a question of getting them going and in rhythm in game time. I don't think that game was necessarily going to be predicated on the skill position players. It was more predicated on which quarterback would blink first. And while Justin Herbert didn't blink, Kyler Murray has the dual threat ability to make big plays, and that's what won the Cardinals that game. And in this game, I feel like everything's going to click. It's not just going to be about Kyler Murray. It's going to be about how he distributes the ball in this game. And thus, that is why I feel so strongly that he should be someone who could warrant a start for you at the QB position. Well, moving on to the running back position, I kind of feel like David Montgomery is going to have a big game. Now, I'm blanking on who the Lions are playing. I believe they're playing the Packers this week. Titans this week. So it's going to be a matchup where you feel like David Montgomery, now that you know the injury concerns from last week's game did not rear their ugly head, he will play in this matchup and against a Titans run defense that hasn't really been the main force for them. They have been a good defense, but their run defense has been leaky. I do think that both him and Jahmyr Gibbs will warrant a look as your starting running backs. I feel that, this is a Lions team capable of running the football with either of these guys as their quote-unquote starter. But because of their potency, this two-back tandem works so nicely no matter the status of this backfield. And so that's why I believe that David Montgomery, even though there were some injury concerns last week, will look fresh and ready in this game against the Titans' run defense that I feel like people might be overrating at this point. And then at the wide receiver position, I feel like this matchup is kind of the one that's most contentious and kind of one that I'm thinking about in my brain and contemplating whether or not I should have picked this guy, but I'm going to stick with it because I believe that this wide receiver is an X factor to his team's success, not just in this game, because it's a very, very integral game to get them going, but for the rest of the season for them. And that is A.J. Brown. Now, this Eagles-Bengals game, a lot of people are saying this is the game of the week. I think that there are other games out there that we'll get to in my implication segment that might be better, but I do think that this is important for both these teams. For the Eagles to establish an identity that isn't just, too tailored to what Saquon Barkley brings to the table. I feel like, yes, you are concerned about Jalen Hurts not stretching the field vertically as much and not relying on his arm talent, but I do believe that when they connect, him and A.J. Brown, this offense becomes much more potent because A.J. Brown was brought in to this Eagles team to be that vertical element for them, and to underutilize him or to not utilize him at all would be a travesty, especially in this game where you can exploit this Bengals defense. A lot of people might say the Bengals secondary is quote-unquote the best part of this team, but I do feel like there will be opportunities at every single level of the field for A.J. Brown to wreak havoc and make things easier for Jalen Hurts, because that's the basis for what I think this offense should be founded upon. Making sure that Jalen Hurts' turnovers don't show up in games such as this, or don't show up at all, and he is protective of the football in a way that can open this offense up to new avenues, but still allow them to win a lot of games. And A.J. Brown's going to be that X factor because, for one, he is only going to be involved with one route, and that's the goal route or the post route. And you know that they want to take that shot, but it's going to be heavily reliant on Jalen Hurts to be able to get him the football in those situations. But in this game, against this opponent, in an intra-conference game, I feel like their identity can be established, and we see a lot of A.J. Brown in this one as well, and a lot of explosive plays from the Eagles offense, for that matter. The tight end position, I really like Dalton Kincaid against Seattle in a matchup that certainly feels like it shouldn't favor him, but it's one of those situations where I kind of feel like, yes, the Seattle defense is getting healthier, but how will the incorporation and reintegration of these players into the squad affect the overall layout of this team? And also, you're bringing in Ernest Jones IV from Tennessee to immediately step into your starting rotation, and that could really muddy the waters in the middle of the park, where Dalton Kincaid will be doing most of his work for Buffalo. So look for Dalton Kincaid in this matchup to really try and exploit the fact that some Seattle players who are coming back either A, haven't played enough to fully grasp the Mike Macdonald system, or B, just aren't confident in this Mike Macdonald system as much as those who did have time within it. So look for any alignment for Dalton Kincaid to involve him being involved in and around all the different plays that he should be. And not for nothing, I do believe that there's so much diversity now in the Bills offense that perhaps this pick will look silly at the tight end position, but I still think Dalton Kincaid is worthy of a starting role in a fantasy football squad as potentially your tight end one, and if not, then a high-end flex option for you. And to close out this segment, for the final position, the defense that I think will have a good week, or the best week out of all those I ranked, is the LA Chargers. Now, here's the thing about the Chargers defense. I feel like a lot of people either overrate them or feel like they should be worse based off of the offensive struggles and because they're often injured. But I feel like the Chargers are a team that doesn't necessarily get called into question too much. They don't fall under much scrutiny, win or lose. And that game against the Cardinals, yes, it's kind of concerning, and it was a primetime game for them. But I feel like when your defense only gives up 2 explosive plays to really swing the tie in the opponent's favor, then you can't really take that much blame, especially for what this Chargers defense has been through. They've had a couple injuries this season. Joey Bosa's been out. I believe a lot of injuries in their secondary and things of that nature. But in this match with the Saints, they don't have to worry that much about, dual threat QBs, tough physical receivers, tough physical tight ends, and they can just focus on winning the easy games in their slate. And I guarantee you, this defense will be the reason why the Chargers are in the playoff conversation late in the season. Because of the fact that A, their schedule is easy, and B, they're not the ones who are going to fall under scrutiny if, pundits start worrying about the Chargers for some weird reason. But at the end of the day, the Chargers can take care of business for you in certain situations as a top defense to consider for fantasy football. But let me know what you guys think about this in the comments. I really like this segment a lot. But when we come back after this short break, we're going to transition a little bit from starts to sits, talking about some guys who can stay on the bench this weekend for you. But don't go anywhere. We will be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of the day here, I do want to remind you yet again that if you feel like you want to interact more directly with the show and other shows around the network, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to contribute and interact with the network. For example, one of two things can take place. You can either just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you have throughout the show. That could be anything ranging from opinions to trade advice, what have you. I am up for it. Or you can click the $sign in the comment section as well, and you can leave a tip or donation. Either way, everything you do for the network is greatly appreciated. It just makes us that much more better and that much more happy talking to you guys and experiencing this show in a different and diverse way. But without further ado, let's get into our second segment. Like I said, we talked about our favorite starts of the week. Now we got to do the sits. And this is always a comfortable segment because of the fact that you never want to talk about those guys you might have to leave on the bench. But it's an integral part of understanding your fantasy decisions and how it could affect your team. Without further ado, I'm going to do the same thing, position by position, and talk about the guys who I think might have to sit this week out. And this one seems like an easy one at QB. It's Anthony Richardson going up against the Texans, for a second straight time in their division. And this just feels like a matchup where, yes, you feel that because it's a divisional game, the Colts will still be in it, because divisional games are always those kinds of games where you feel like you can steal them on any given Sunday. But the reason why I think Anthony Richardson is a sit is because of the fact that I don't see a path forward where he can have much success if you take his traits as either or. And what I mean by that is you can't decide whether he's going to affect the game more as a runner or as a passer, because both of those traits are two of his better traits, his arm strength and his dual threat abilities. But you're going to have to at some point take your peaks with your valleys, because he's a very raw player still, hasn't had that many games in the NFL thus far, and you can't really say what the best of him looks like. So in this game, look for him to really struggle, because outside of, the deep shots to his guys in the perimeter who he really likes, and the option runs that he sometimes has, he's just a guy who is going through the motions and really getting lost in the rigors of the NFL. And if there's no sense of direction anytime soon, he can find himself on this list more often than not. But this week especially, I think Richardson struggles a lot more than, just his ordinary struggles in this matchup. At the running back position, though, I have a feeling that this guy is slowly falling out of favor in a lot of fantasy leagues. Ramondre Stevenson. Through no fault of his own, because Drake May coming into this team has really elevated the passing game. I feel like there's a lot more opportunities there. And also, I feel like JaMycal Hasty might be a guy who warrants a look in the Patriots' backfield a little more often. But for some weird reason, I had a feeling this is where Ramondre Stevenson would be at the middle of the season. A guy who would tend to keep the Patriots in games early in the season more often than not, but kind of towards the middle, peter out because he's asked to carry too heavy a burden. And so I feel like when I think about the Patriots going up into this match with the Jets, I feel like the reason why they brought in Drake May, even in this situation, is for games like this. Because the Jets are a defense that is getting better against the run, perhaps one of the more potent run defenses in the league. And you definitely, with a very shaky offensive line, don't know what your offensive game plan is going to look like just because of the physicality of the Jets' run defense and what they can force you to do. So look for Drake May to be a little bit rattled and for there to be a little bit of a disconnect between him and the backfield, and thus less touches for Ramondre Stevenson, because I feel like the Patriots might be trying to play catch-up in this game, and Drake May will throw the ball more often than not anyways, just because of the fact that they want to see what they still have in him, more so than, trying to win this game. So Ramondre Stevenson, unfortunately, has fallen a little bit from grace here, but I still believe that, at some point, he's going to have one of those games that reminds us of what he once was in this season. It's just that, the Patriots are at a place where Ramondre Stevenson running the ball 30 to 35 times a game is sustainable. And I really think that it was the best decision to bring in Drake May to try to find stability in the passing game. So that's why I feel like Ramondre Stevenson deserves a little bit of a benching for the time being. With the wide receiver position here, this is a guy who also is slowly falling out of favor, not just in fantasy, but with his team. I feel like the profile of his team doesn't necessarily predicate itself on needing him as much as I initially thought. That being said, this could come back to bite me because of the fact of how well the Ravens offense and the Browns defense matches up. I think it's going to be a really intriguing chess match between these two units. So I don't really know if this guy will affect the game. But Zay Flowers, at least in my opinion, in this matchup is someone who might suffer. And that being said, I still think that in order to really test this Browns secondary, which is perhaps the best secondary in the league, even with all the concerns with, how long they've been out on the field, they're still going to keep this Browns team in this game. And Zay Flowers, not for nothing, could be someone who we view as an X factor in this game. The guy who really opens up this Browns secondary. And so this is why this could be a very contentious pick to sit for your fantasy squad. But it's also one where I feel like the Ravens are super confident in their offensive game plan right now. And that game plan is one that tends to lean more physical than, more flair-like. What I mean by that is, Zay Flowers, yes, he brings a lot of value in terms of his route running, his speed, but I do feel like now with the addition of Derrick Henry and the incorporation of Rashad Bateman, this team can not only outrun you, it can out-physical you as well. And now you have to account for Lamar passing the ball deep. You still have to account for his legs, and you have to account for Derrick Henry. I feel like Zay Flowers is only going to be used in situations in which, A, the Ravens are in the red zone, and they might want to diversify the playbook a little bit, or B, in situations where they're running away with it, if you know what I mean. And that's no indictment of Zay Flowers, because I still think he's a very talented receiver, and he will have certain games where he stands out. But in this matchup, I feel like Zay Flowers is not someone who will define the reason why the Ravens could win this game and should win this game. It's going to be more about the physicality. It's going to be more about, smash mouth football that I might think for this Ravens offense. And then for the tight ends, I think this guy, had a little bit of promise to start the season. He was getting more involved in this offense. A lot of people were talking about how he needed to be more involved in this offense. But now, after the past couple of weeks, he slowly lost a little bit of his luster and now has gotten back to the guy who's going to continue to have question marks surrounding him if, he does not perform to his expectations. And that is Kyle Pitts. Now, I don't think that this situation is entirely Kyle Pitts' fault. I think being drafted number 4 overall as a tight end puts a lot of pressure on any certain player, especially at that position group. But I do feel that in, I believe, his 4th year in the league, this is the moment where he needs to see some sort of turnaround. But he does seem to be one of those players who can't just seem to consistently get his head into games. Last week we saw it against Seattle where they really shut him down in that department. And so, in this divisional matchup, the rematch, perhaps the best game of the season thus far, look for Kyle Pitts to not really be a factor. I feel like both of these teams, the Falcons and the Bucs, will want to run the football a lot to try and control their offense and dictate the line of scrimmage and, tire out each other's defenses. So that's why I feel like Kyle Pitts might be a non-factor. But, he could get some good garbage time touches if, the Falcons are up in this game. And so that's why I feel like Kyle Pitts is just someone who week in, week out, I can't really pin my finger on because of the fact he's too volatile in how he plays. And thus, that's why I feel like this week he's not someone who I would hinge my entire fantasy squad on at the tight end position. Then the final defense that we're going to talk about in terms of the defense that I think should sit is the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, let's be honest with you. I do feel that the Raiders defense is the best unit for them and the reason why they're going to win games, but this certainly feels like a step too much for them. I feel like the Chiefs' offense, yes, has had its ups and downs throughout this season, but when I look at this matchup, I kind of feel like now there's too much to account for with the addition of DeAndre Hopkins and, the incorporation of these different receivers to really account for all of them, especially all with the tension surrounding this team as well and surrounding this defensive unit as well. Whether or not, Max Crosby was going to leave, there were some rumors about that, whether or not this Raiders defense would still be the physical defense this team relied upon. And so that is why I feel like this week is going to be a step too far for this team, and we're going to start to see some of the cracks in the foundation of the Las Vegas Raiders in this game. On both sides of the football, not just the defense, but with the defense, it's going to be troubling because you kind of needed to rely on it to have any hopes of winning games such as this. Not for nothing, yes, there have been seasons in the past where the Raiders have held their own or either beaten this Chiefs team, but this year just feels like a year where the Raiders might be a little bit lackluster. And so that is why I think in this game you're not going to look like the sum of their parts. But let me know what you think in the comments. Coming up after this short break, we're going to be looking at all our implication games for this coming weekend, both the NFL first and college football. And this is one of my favorite segments to present to you guys, so don't go anywhere. We will be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And now our third segment of the day is switching over to a popular Friday segment, our implication games. That is, games in both the NFL and college football that I believe will have the hugest fantasy implications for your respective squads. We start off in the NFL as always. Hope you guys enjoyed this segment as always. But we have a lot of good games, and the 4 ones I have chosen, to me, at the very least, mean the most from a fantasy standpoint. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with a game that kind of lost a little bit of its luster in this matchup here, but still to me resembles a game where offense really could win the day. And that is Bears and Commanders. I initially was saying that the big reason why this was a huge fantasy game was because of the rookie QBs, but unfortunately one of them will not be playing this game, and that is Jaden Daniels. After suffering a rib injury last week, we wish him the best, hope for a speedy recovery, wish for more exploits of his on the field in the future. But I still think this is an exciting game. I feel like, the pressure's taken off of Caleb Williams' shoulders, and in a game that's perhaps, like I said before, the toughest remaining on the Bears' schedule outside of, trying to chip away at their division, I feel like this game could see a lot of the weapons on the Bears continue to come to life. They're the team fresh off the bye, and they should come in like they mean it. They really are playing with house money here. They don't really have to worry about the different storylines leading up to this game, or with, the potential of this could have been the number 1 versus number 2 pick playing at each other. But I do feel like the Bears now have the upper hand, and they should feel confident, and thus I think you should feel confident in all their weapons coming into this game, whether it be guys like Swift, whether it be guys like DJ Moore, whether it even be Caleb himself. I think that this team is primed for a big fantasy week. On the Commanders side of things, I'm actually very intrigued in terms of how Mariota plays this game out, just because I feel like he's very similar to what they had with Jaden Daniels in terms of running this offense, but I don't necessarily think the vertical passing game will really be a factor for them in this one. Look for Mariota to try and manage this game. There'll still be moments where his flashiness will come into play due to his dual threat abilities, but I don't necessarily think we'll see much passes 50-plus yards or more like we did with Jaden Daniels. But that being said, that's also an interesting point about, not just him, but how these receivers will look. Because these receivers want to get more vertical than not. And Terry McLaurin has a very intriguing matchup that we spoke about in our Shadow Report earlier in the week against Jalen Johnson. So this will come down to, in terms of a fantasy perspective, whether or not Marcus Mariota wants to take a deep shot, or whether or not he might have to stay in this game. Because I think this could be a classic shootout in the NFC. And both of these teams have the firepower to hold up in that situation. But it's going to come down to, for the Commanders especially, how they feel their game plan can work. Because the Bears' defense, I'll give them the edge. And the Commanders' defense, not so much. So you kind of feel like the Commanders' offense has to live up to its billing here, even with Marcus Mariota at the helm. So, that being said, look for a game where one team clearly has the fantasy motivation, the fantasy potential, but the other could sneakily be one to look out for. Because I'm not saying that Terry McLaurin will have a good game, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind if Washington stays in this game. Because I feel like they are well equipped to, even though the Bears have all the momentum here. So that's why I feel like from a fantasy standpoint, this game could be so intriguing just outside of the Bears side of things, because the Commanders have the weaponry to hold up themselves in their own right. And then let's transition to the divisional matchup of the week, the rematch, or perhaps, like I said, the best game of the season between the Falcons and the Bucs. Now, it might not have been the best game to some of your opinions, but I'll be able to lower it down to the craziest game of the NFL season, because it looked like the Bucs were going to run out the clock, control the football at the end of the game, and all of a sudden the Falcons showed up on both sides of the football, and the Bucs looked like the most inept offense on earth, and we see Atlanta steal it at home. In this game, very different situation. Another situation where the fantasy implications were marred by injuries as well, because now Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are going to be out of this one. And I'm sorry in advance, because these were all written beforehand, so, things happen, but I still think, like I said, with the Bears and Commanders game, this should be an interesting one because it opens up the Bucs running back room, which is, in my opinion, one of the deeper ones in the league, and really pits it against the Falcons' best, which is perhaps the best running back duo in the league, if you look at it from that perspective. And I feel like this game is going to be much more slower paced than the other because of the fact that both of these teams feel like they can win games running the football. But we haven't necessarily seen it with either of them is the true kind of crux of the issue here. For the Falcons, though, I certainly feel like they have a formula where, they have to help Kirk Cousins out, and it predicates itself on, stemming from these backs. Whereas the Bucs are going to kind of have to be forced into utilizing these backs to the best of their abilities. And so that's where this running back situation really becomes a conundrum for fantasy managers, because I feel like they're the positions you should trust the most in this game, but also I feel like it's highly contingent on, the Bucs needing this game more and how they might have to change their offensive game plan to kind of fully dive into this game. And so, looking at this matchup, you would think that the Bucs would be leaning on the run game more, but the thing is, they can't always rely upon it because this is a must-win game for them. Because if they lose this game, they are now 0-2 against the Falcons, and way behind in the NFC South race, especially in the tiebreaker scenario. So look for that to really bring to light what the Bucs might have in terms of depth, but also in terms of trying to win this game. On the Falcons side of things, I kind of feel like they also might be needed to meaning to run the football, but in a way that can be complementary to what their passing attack has shown thus far, because their passing attack is still potent. But overall, I think this is going to be a very feisty, very tense divisional showdown. Now let's switch to the Cowboys 49ers, which I did say was going to be a fantasy snooze fest. And the reason why I put this game is because I never really talk about games that I feel like will underwhelm from a fantasy perspective. But this game is so unusual because it's not necessarily through the fault of either of these teams. It's just through the fact that whether it be on the 49ers side of things, injuries have gotten in their way. On the Cowboys side of things, they haven't been able to get out their own way. It just adds up to a matchup where you have to say, well, somebody has to be the answer for either of these teams. Someone has to be the answer for my fantasy team. Because a lot of people placed a lot of weight, I believe, on these teams in fantasy. For two players, Christian McCaffrey, who hasn't played a snap all season, and CeeDee Lamb, who, yes, might just be a top 3 receiver in the league, but is playing under this burden of needing to live up to his contract's expectations. And that's why this game is so much more deep than just, the difference between winning or losing in fantasy. Because players in this game certainly can win you a fantasy game. But I feel like the deeper underlying roots of this game stem from the fact that both of these teams need them certain players to step up. That's my question. Can anyone step up for either of these teams in place of these said superstars to alleviate some of the pressure? For the 49ers, this might be how they're going to have to look for quite some time. Because even though McCaffrey could come back either this week potentially or next week, I still don't see how this offense can, sustain itself without, Brock Purdy's full disposal of weapons there. And on the Cowboys side of things, I can't say it enough. You just need anyone outside of Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb to be the answer for your struggles and the answer to your prayers in that regard. So look for this to be a matchup where there's a lot of frustration in terms of fantasy and how players are performing, but also one that could reveal the direction of both of these offenses, whether for good or bad, and whether or not you might dive even deeper into the well in terms of fantasy for both of these teams as well. And the last game I want to talk about here, perhaps the most intriguing one, interconference game, the Bills traveling coast to coast to face the Seattle Seahawks in a very underrated matchup. Now, yes, this Seattle team from a fantasy perspective has lost a little bit of its luster this week, well, with the injury to Metcalf, but I still think, the Seattle offense is certainly going to be a wild card week in, week out in terms of how it looks from a fantasy perspective, because DK has really been the engine room and Kenneth Walker has been a nice supplement, but I still think sans, Metcalf, I think that there's a lot of talent there they can still utilize. I like Tyler Lockett still. He's not, as explosive as DK, but can still get the job done. Very reliable. JSN is going to show how savvy and intelligent he can be. He's now going to be the vertical threat in this game. And Jake Bobo, now who's potentially going to be the wide receiver 3, is another one of those guys who's just a reliable, natural receiver. And not for nothing, Noah Fant and A.J. Barner have been revelations at the tight end position. Noah Fant, after, this being his 3rd season there and being one of the key contributors to this offense, and A.J. Barner, a new rookie who I'm keeping my eye on in terms of how he could explode from a fantasy perspective, just immediately seamlessly fitting into this team that uses a lot of 2 tight end sets. On the Seattle side of things, I feel like there's still a lot of upside. On the Bills side of things, there's going to be a lot of talk about how Amari Cooper plays for these next couple of weeks, because if he plays like he did against the Titans, then there's a lot of hope that he still has fantasy value. But if not, then the Bills lose a little bit of his luster. But also, it's going to rely upon Josh Allen's trust in him as well, because if there's no trust there, then I feel like this could go off the rails. But if, Josh Allen trusts Amari Cooper more than, say, he did Stephon Diggs, then this team can work magic. And so that's what I'm looking for in this matchup. On the Seahawks side of things, for them to really show the diversity of their offense, and the Bills side of things, to really show that Amari Cooper could still be one of the more talented wide receiver ones in the league, and in fantasy as well. Let me know what you think about all these games in the comments. Coming up for our 4th segment of the day here, we're going to switch over to the world of college football very briefly to talk about some of those big games with huge fantasy implications as well. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our 4th segment of the day, our one and only college football segment of the day, transitioning from the NFL games with huge fantasy implications to the college football ones. And the 4 that I've compiled here, very, very interesting games. I feel like 2 of them are a little bit off kilter, and 2 of them are huge SEC matchups that could be playoff eliminators. A lot of them involve some key players in key situations for their teams. So look for this to be a very rich fantasy weekend for you from that perspective. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with a huge group of 5 game actually taking place tonight. Boise State, UNLV could be the marbles game. I like to say that any game such as this is a marbles game because it's for all of them. This is perhaps the matchup that determines the group of 5 conference champion that's going to make it to the CFP. And not for nothing, these two teams are offensively well equipped to really make this a true fantasy shootout here, on the field and off. And if you have any one of these players who I'm going to talk about, look for them to truly the stars. Boise State, it's the one and only Ashton Jeanty. I feel like, from what I hear of his journey, he's someone who's dedicated himself to sticking with an identity, sticking with one program. His decision to stay with Boise State is paying dividends. It's giving them the national profile of a team that you might not expect to see in the national spotlight as much, or in this era of football, of college football especially. But he's doing it in such a way that is so unequivocally dominant that you have to respect what he means for college football and what he means for fantasy college football, because this is the type of player who, if you're not necessarily interested in fantasy college football, makes you interested, catches your eye. This is a guy who has already has 17 touchdowns, over 1,200 yards this season, and he still has, 6 games to play, including tonight's. So look for him to be someone who, for this one season in fantasy college football and for many seasons thereafter in the NFL, as someone who's just that it factor for your fantasy team. Or if you're someone who's a little bit more ambitious and is in a dynasty league, he's your RB1 as soon as he enters the league. And that's why I feel like this game for him is perhaps one we truly know what he brings to not just fantasy sports, but to the entire fantasy landscape for the next decade, because that is a dynasty type player in this matchup at a school such as Boise State that's not been getting that much attention over the past couple of years. On the UNLV side of things, they've been getting a lot of attention, sometimes for the wrong reasons. Of course, the whole NIL drama with Matthew Sluka. Now, Malik Williams, the former Camel, stepping in to the QB role and hasn't missed a beat. I feel like this team has a lot of explosive talent. I like Ricky White, their receiver, a lot. They have a very deep receiver room as well. But I do think that the problem I see with UNLV is that they don't necessarily have the defensive resources to account for what Jeanty brings to the table. While I do think that Malik Williams and Ricky White are a nice connection, nice stack in fantasy terms, I do believe that the UNLV defense is going to be the reason why Ashton Jeanty is going to have as good a game as he is. And so that caveat there is a reason why I feel like UNLV will lose its luster in terms of a fantasy perspective. But I still think that Jeanty doesn't have to be the biggest story of this game. Malik Williams can prove himself in this game as well. It's just a matter of, how many times he gets to prove himself over a guy like Ashton Jeanty, because he's going to take up a lot of space in this one. We'll look for this to be an exciting group of 5 game, potentially for all the marbles, because of the stakes. But it should be a good one. Transitioning now to the SEC. Very intriguing matchup here between 2 undefeated conference teams looking to make a CFP run. The LSU Tigers and the Texas A&M Aggies. These are 2 offenses that are not the most appealing from a fantasy perspective, but have the big play in them. With LSU, you have Garrett Nussmeier and the talented crop of young receivers with Kyron Lacey and CJ Daniels. On the other side of things, with Texas A&M, they're playing ball control offense to a T right now. Making that transition from Marcel Reed, you would suspect, would be a kind of dual threat, big play kind of guy who will be really explosive in a fantasy setting, to Connor Wegman, you get now more of a balanced attack where Wegman kind of keeps this team on schedule but is not flashy in terms of stats. And Le'Veon Moss is the reason why they are such a fascinating fantasy team. So that's why I think that this matchup is so complicated to dissect from a fantasy standpoint, but could be very explosive. Because I love Garrett Nussmeier, perhaps out of all these QBs who are looking to become pro-ready, perhaps the most pro-ready. It sounds funny to say out of all of them. And I think he can prove it in this game against a very stout Texas A&M defensive front. The Texas A&M side of things, if their ball control offense is what it's going to be, then so be it. They are a team well equipped to completely out-physical SEC teams because their offensive side of the football knows its identity now. Their defense is one of the most potent in the country. And thus, that's why I feel like, I wouldn't be mad, if Connor Wegman didn't have as many yards as some other guys, but Le'Veon Moss carry the load. And so that's what I want to see. Both these teams to understand their identities, but also from a fantasy standpoint, to understand that it's not just about, putting up points. It's about putting up points efficiently. And so this game might anger a couple of fantasy managers in terms of those who have guys like Nussmeier and Moss, but it's still going to be a game that holds a lot of weight. But now let's get back to a game that has a lot of playoff stakes, but interestingly enough, for both teams now rather than just one. And this game is perhaps the most exciting it's been or ever going to be thus far to this point, and that is Notre Dame Navy. Boise State UNLV, like I said, could be the Group of 5 decider. But if Navy wins this football game, they are the only undefeated Group of 5 team outside of the other military service academy, Army, which could lead to huge college football playoff implications in that game as well. But first, they got to get through perhaps their only ranked opponent of the season, their only chance for a ranked win, should Army falter along the way or not be seen as someone who's had as good a schedule as Navy's in the long run. What I love about this game is that both of these offenses seem so starkly similar. Because for Navy, it's just 3 guys. Horvath holding down the option offense at quarterback, one of the top quarterbacks in the nation in terms of total QBR. Texa the fullback, averaging 6.5 yards per carry, and Eli Heidenreich, who's averaging 200 yards per game at the running back position. Those are the 3 guys that hold the most weight in the system. On the other side of the football, I feel like it's centered around the importance of Riley Leonard in this attack, because he's a dual threat guy, but I feel like in order for Notre Dame to realize its full potential, he's going to need to pass the football a little bit more. The question that remains, though, is who is going to pass the football to, because there's a lot of talent, but it's not necessarily the best talent in the nation for Riley Leonard to throw the football to. I like their tight end room. I love Mitchell Evans as their number 1 option, but Jaden Greathouse and some other guys there aren't necessarily going to be the guys to carry the load, should Riley Leonard be more pass happy this week. Not for nothing, both of these defenses feel like they can falter a little bit in certain situations. Navy has not faced an offense as tricky as Notre Dame's, but Notre Dame has not faced a defense as physical as Navy's. So that's going to be the question. Which of these offenses can get the most out of their key men in this game? And I feel like that's where Navy might have the slight edge from a fantasy standpoint, but also in real life as well. Because this triple option is not just, your grandma's triple option, your grandpa's triple option. This is a modern triple option offense for Navy being run to a T by 3 fantastic players. So that's the challenge there. And the last one I want to discuss, Mizzou, Alabama. This is a game that still has a lot of talent, but two underwhelming teams at center at the end of the day. On the Mizzou side of things, I don't believe that Brady Cook has fully gotten up to speed at all this season. Yes, he had a game where he came back from the hospital to lead Missouri to that comeback. I forget who against. I'm going to have to look it up after. But he's still someone who I don't necessarily trust in this setting. On the Alabama side of things, they just rely too much on the explosive play. And I love that, Ryan Williams has been incorporated into this team. I love that Jeremy Bernard has found a home here after struggling to find time at Washington. But it's a team that still is too reliant on offense and the explosive play on defense, just lost a lot of its talent. And the same could be said of Missouri, where, the offense has really been struggling, and so has the defense. But the reason why this game still has a lot of fantasy upside is because of the fact that there are game wreckers all on the field. For Missouri, it's Luther Burden III. He's still one of the best receivers in the nation, and if Brady Cook can find a rhythm in this one, he can definitely be an X factor. And for Alabama, it's going to come down to, how much Jalen Milroe can operate out of structure. He's going to want to get vertical in the pass game. He's going to want to be explosive, but there's going to come a time where he might struggle against this Missouri defense. And he's going to have to pick and choose his spots to exploit this Missouri secondary. But at the end of the day, I feel like that's the reason why I still hold a lot of weight in my mind when I think about this from a fantasy perspective. Because of the fact that I know what these two teams are capable of, and I know what their game records especially are capable of. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Coming up to close out the show, though, we go back to Sunday Night Football, a topic we discussed on yesterday's show. Just giving you some start-sit fantasy advice for this one to close out the show and the week of the show. The GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our final segment of the day, and for that matter, the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Now, like I said before the break, we are going to be transitioning back to the NFL, but to a specific game, Sunday Night Football. We talked a little bit about it yesterday in terms of a betting perspective. Now we get to look at it a little bit more from a fantasy perspective, in particular who to start and who to sit. Now, I did write a lot of this before, like I always do, so I might have to rejigger it, much like I did last week in that game with the Steelers and the Jets. But I do feel like it's still pretty clear-cut who the danger men in this game are and who clearly is not. And it doesn't necessarily matter with the injuries both teams are going through, who could step up. It's more a matter of who I believe will be forced to step up. Because this is what this game feels like. It feels very forced. A lot of tension in these two offenses. Whether it be through the circumstances the 49ers have been through with injuries, or what the Cowboys have been with just not being able to incorporate enough players outside of Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb into this offense. But without further ado, let's just go into who I personally believe will have to either start or sit in this game. And the first start that I did have was Brandon Ayuk, and so you all can see how that has gone. Now he's out for the season. But I do feel on the 49ers side of things, a player who I'm confident should start, and don't be surprised here, is Brock Purdy. I feel like, that game against the Chiefs was not indicative of who he was. The Chiefs are playing lights out on the defensive side of the football, and it was a game where Brock Purdy, the cards were stacked against him. Now, I personally have him on my bench this week for fantasy football, but the reason why I feel like he warrants a start is because he now understands what the system is without all of his offensive weapons. And he now understands, most importantly, how he has to simplify certain things when this occurs. Because before, it certainly felt like he was going a little too fast and the game sped up for him. Now, I kind of feel like he's had enough games without all of his talent where he's saying to himself, okay, maybe I got to slow things down, simplify some things, and not hype myself up over about how I can have to win this game for my team. And so that's why I feel like this week against the Cowboys defense that really has looked inept, and I don't think will have found its footing after this bye week. Look for Brock Purdy to put up serviceable stats. Look for him to kind of look himself again, to a point where he's managing the game much like he should and feels comfortable, with understanding the circumstances of not having all his weapons around him. Because I still think he's a great QB. It's just that, in certain situations, things might have moved too fast for him. Now, on the sit side of things, there are a couple players on the 49ers who I really have not been impressed by this season in terms of their production for this offense. And one of them has been George Kittle. Now, I know that George Kittle is one of those players who can sneakily get going at any given time. He still is one of the great tight ends in the league right now. But there have been certain moments where I kind of felt like he's playing himself out of plays and not really being effective in terms of the physicality he can bring to this team and what they need from him. So in this game, even though, this Cowboys defense can be exploited with their thinness at the linebacker position at the current moment in time, but I do feel like George Kittle has been an underwhelming player from a fantasy perspective this season. And I don't know whether or not, it's because of the injuries he has to account for or the pressures that he might feel having to compensate for the lack of depth in the 49ers, skill position groups. But at the end of the day, I feel like this is just a game where I can't see Kittle really being that effective. And so, while I hope that I'm wrong, I just feel like this is just a situation in which it certainly feels like Brock Purdy might want to start incorporating more people. And what I mean by that is, it's no indictment of George Kittle, but it speaks to the necessity of what they might have to do going forward, should some of these injuries start to project to be longer than expected. So George Kittle should be a sit for this one. In terms of another start for this team, well, Brandon Ayuk was going to be it, but how about, Ricky Pearsall? This is a guy I'm really intrigued to see play in the NFL. This is a guy who was nearly fatally shot a couple months ago. First time on an NFL field where, he's going to have to step up in a big way. Perhaps the wide receiver 2 in this game. And so I feel like he warrants not a start potentially, but a position on your team where you can see what he's projected to look like throughout the season, and you can make a decision from there. I'm not saying he should immediately start by any means because He's still a rookie, and this is his first game in the NFL. But there's a situation where we could pick him up off waivers, see what he's like, and then go from there in terms of favorable matchups you could see in his future. But for now, I don't really see another true start on this 49ers team. I like Jawan Jennings, but I don't know how productive he's going to be going forward for this 49ers squad, especially if there's optimism about certain injuries. But again, another sit, I guess you could say. Jawan Jennings could project to be a sit, but I feel like, he's going to do enough for you to either keep him in a flex position or keep him as a bench player. It's just that I feel like there's too many losses on this 49ers team to truly try and figure out who could have a big game rather than who will. So that's the weirdness of the situation with the 49ers right now. Now going over to the Cowboys side of things, and the reason why I become so frustrated talking about the Cowboys from a fantasy perspective is that it's just the same two guys, and any other guy I talk about in any capacity from a fantasy perspective really is from a negative perspective, and it's through no fault of their own, because they still have a lot of talent, in my opinion. As Andre enters the chat, hello my friend, how are you? Happy Friday, just chilling playing the new Black Ops 6. Hopefully it's a good video game and you're having a good experience. Thank you for tuning into today's show, even though we are kind of winding down here. But let's look at the Cowboys before we officially close out the week of shows here. I feel like, like I said, it's the same old story for these Cowboys, where I feel like I forcibly have to say one thing but could have said another, and I sit here and stew about telling you guys how talented the Cowboys is, but the ineptitudes of their coaching and the ineptitudes of the organization as a whole. But I'm going to do it anyways, because we have to entertain this notion and we have to appreciate what these Cowboys can be. Let's start off with the starters here. You have to start CeeDee Lamb, as Andre also has a question. Quick one, full PPR. Do I start Jayden Reed or Higgins this week? I feel like Jayden Reed in this matchup against the Jaguars secondary might, get slowed down a little bit, just because, like I always say, with the Packers it's difficult because of their depth in receiver. But when I look at T. Higgins in this matchup, I kind of feel like the Eagles secondary is diverse enough to slow him down. I know that he's kind of been growing into the season, and a lot of people are hyped about him and his future this season at the very least with the Bengals. But I do think Jayden Reed is the safer play. I do feel that the Packers offense is going to get going. I'm more concerned with the Packers defense, but at least I know that the Packers offense can beat up on this Jaguars defense. It's just going to depend on, how many targets Jayden Reed gets. But I still feel like he's the safer bet here for you. So good luck to you there. But going back to this question and conundrum of who to start and sit for the Cowboys week in, week out, I kind of feel sick to my stomach saying that you have to start CeeDee Lamb week in, week out, because I love CeeDee Lamb. A lot of fantasy football managers love CeeDee Lamb, but it's just too, vanilla. I want to talk about someone in those wide receiver core outside of CeeDee Lamb who I can say, hey, week in, week out, this is a guy who I would like to see you start. But CeeDee Lamb is so centripetal. No, I don't think that's the right word. So integral, so to speak, for this Cowboys offense. You just can't ignore him. So, unfortunately, I can't really say outside of CeeDee Lamb that any one of these receivers is going to step up. And that's why I have, for my big sit option for the Cowboys, Jalen Tolbert. As Andre said, Kyron is on pace for 15 plus TDs What an animal he is. I was completely wrong at him. Maybe even 20 adds Andre. I was completely wrong about him to start the season. I was saying that he would regress because we only saw one small sample size season from him, but he has proven me wrong. And he also asks Andre, do I start Kraft or Ferguson? This one feels a bit easier. I feel like Kraft is the start for you. I would like to say Ferguson, but he really hasn't shown me much in this Cowboys offense for me to say I'm confident that he should start week in, week out. Whereas Kraft, I feel like, has proven a lot of people wrong in standing out as the standalone tight end for this Packers team. But that going back to Jalen Tolbert here, I feel like he's the main option outside of CD as the breakout star for this offense, but I don't know. I feel like this team is too predicated on the Dak and CD show, and it leaves me so maddened that I can't introduce you guys to certain players to incorporate into your fantasy squad, but it is what it is, and I don't want to end the show on a maddening note, but we do have to end it here. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. As always, thank you guys for tuning in. If you want to view more exclusive short content or content such as this, like, follow, and subscribe. Also, keep on making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to interact with the show. But other than that, we'll be back next week on Monday, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Other than that, enjoy your weekend. Have a good one, enjoying all your football action. I am out.